Salut.
你好，
E aí,
Untitled
galera?
Chapter.
欢迎来到 Travel Tribe。
Bem-vindo ao Travel
Et
Tribe.
bienvenue au podcast de Triple Trip.
Welcome to the Travel Tribe podcast. Exploring the world is a dream for many. However, it can prove to be quite expensive. One avenue to turning that dream into a reality is looking into the opportunities offered by teaching internationally. Teaching abroad allows you to immerse yourself in cultures all around the world, help shape and impact the future youth of our world, and on top of that, get paid and have other perks like housing and flight allowances. For all the opportunities out there, however, the world of international schools can also be a minefield. Our guest today, Sam Campeau, has been an international teacher for over a decade and has recently written a book giving tips and tricks on what to look for prospective teachers interested in teaching internationally. He shares how to vet prospective employers, how to prepare yourself before taking on an international assignment, how to get your foot in the door if you have limited experience, some of his experiences working and living in dangerous countries around the world, and finally, some of the hot areas where there's a huge demand for teachers. Please welcome Sam to the Travel Tribe. Hey Sam, thanks for joining us today. Let's just dive right into it. What was the original inspiration for you wanting to go teach internationally?
There were a few factors at play. I had always kind of been interested, especially when I make that big leap out to the West Coast. Suddenly, travel and living far from home didn't seem as daunting anymore. And I realized there was a lot more that I still wanted to explore. Part of it was inspiration from my brother. He was already traveling internationally before he finished high school, and I thought, oh, that seemed really cool. So, how could I do that and tie it into a career so that I could? So I wouldn't just be vacationing and draining up my savings. Yeah, how could I do this in a way that's more sustainable? There was also another economic reason that I decided on it, which was as I got into that second year of working in Oregon. If you recall, back in 2007. We hadn't hit the economic crisis yet, but as is true with so many things, there was an economic crisis in Oregon before it was cool, and so we were already seeing severe shortages for our education budget statewide. That's why I couldn't find any work in Portland, and it was out of my cadre of 30 educators in the grad program. Only a handful of us were able to get full-time work after we graduated. So I was very lucky. But in that second year, my principal quietly approached me and said, listen, we don't know if you're going to have a job next year. Everything's getting cut. And you've talked about possibly working overseas. This may be the year to look at doing that. And so that's when I got introduced to the concept of the job fair and just the wide world of international teaching.
So, did you have any fears before you were going to go abroad?
Well, you have your usual apprehensions, like, how much of the local language will I need to know? How will I be able to get things that I like to have around, whether it's kitchen ingredients or, preferred shampoos or whatever. I mean, there's things like that. There's also the people usually have concerns about, risks to their personal health and well-being, which, was definitely a concern for me with that first contract being Lebanon, because it wasn't the best year for Lebanon politically. and so I definitely had some real fears going in, because things were happening on the news with Lebanon in the weeks and months leading to my my deployment out there, and it was it kept me up at night. Of course, when I got there, it was not the scenes that CNN was portraying. It was pretty civil, but there were some issues happening in the country for sure. But I noticed that whether it was Lebanon or Bali or even a super safe place like Italy, I always kind of got that same sentiment from friends and family. They would say, "Well, you just need to be safe out there. Be careful. You need to be careful. Be safe." Like there's some like it's complete anarchy outside of the United States, you know.
I had the same experience. I started teaching in South Korea in 2013, and tensions were pretty high actually during that point. And there was like test rockets being launched, and on CNN it was already the headlines were like World War III is on the verge, or Seoul is about to turn into a city of fire. And I remember going to my class next day, and I was like, I was telling my kids, I'm like, what are you guys doing here? Like we're about to die, And they're just like, it's no big deal. Like he's been doing it for the last 60 years. It's totally cool. So I totally can relate to that same kind of anxiety that your parents feel or your family feels when you go abroad to these countries, because they get all the information from CNN and the news, and they don't really know what's going on the ground floor. So
yeah. I mean, my parents, to their credit, I think they got pretty jaded to it after Lebanon. From that point forward, they're like, he's just going to do what he's going to do. But yeah, I mean, Lebanon is probably the of all the places, that was probably the one place where there might have been some relevant concern, because things did really melt down in by the time we got to like November, December. There was some stuff going on with Hezbollah, and things were really disintegrating in the city. There had already been a number of car bombs and things. But the crazy thing is when you're actually living there and something like that happens, like I had played it over in my head a million times before I had even arrived. Like, how am I going to respond when there's a real threat, when something like a car bomb actually happens? What's that going to feel like for me? And I just kept playing these dread tapes in my head over and over. And when something actually happened, it was the first time a car bomb went off, and I was watching it on TV while getting my hair cut. And I asked the barber, like, "Whoa, where's that happening?" And he says, "Oh, it's fine. We're safe. It's like 20 minutes from here." Yeah. And I remember thinking, like, if this happened 20 minutes from where I lived in the United States, I mean, everything would come to a grinding halt. But no, I mean, the guy just, finished up my haircut, and I'm walking home, and all the shops are still open. And I mean, we would sometimes call those Beiruti snow days, because they would shut the school for the day for security concerns. But it was, it's like anything, you just kind of get used to it. And I think that, with the current COVID of things, people are globally realizing that, this is what it's like to live in a state of emergency all the time, and you just kind of get on with it.
So what was it like your first year of teaching abroad? How did you adapt to it? What was it, what you expected?
It was a huge learning curve. I mean, I look back on that year, and there's just a lot of facepalm moments. I mean, I really try hard not to be, the stereotypical American when I'm overseas these days. But back then, I was just a moron. I mean, there were some things like, probably the worst case example of this was, it was Lebanese Independence Day. And me and some of the other teachers thought, well, it's Independence Day. This will be fun. We'll shoot off some fireworks from the roof of the building. It was a terrible idea, because, as mentioned before, it was a really tense political situation in the city and the country. And there probably wasn't a worse possible thing we could have done. And it definitely got a lot of the wrong kind of attention. and I look back at things like that and just I really was behaving like the worst kind of American and not even really being conscious of it. And in a way, I'm glad though, because you have to kind of make mistakes to realize that you're making them. And so I like to think that as the years have gone by, I've gotten better about that, and just tried to listen more than talk, and think before I act.
Yeah.
So there's also the work, that I would say the expectations in a lot of overseas schools are higher for teachers than in American public. In American public, there were I found a lot of parents who weren't involved, who were really checked out, who would just kind of leave it up to the teacher. When I worked in American overseas schools, it's completely the opposite. Very involved parents. A lot of times, the families are fairly well off. Maybe only one parent has to work, and so the other one is dedicating all their time to their child's education, which is great. But it can also result in, helicopter parenting. It can, but on the positive, it can result in having no shortage of parent volunteers to help you sort out the class library, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So they're very different, and it comes with a lot of pluses and minuses.
Were there any other differences you noticed between teaching at an American public school in the States and teaching overseas?
Well, I always tell my friends and family when they ask that kind of question that probably the biggest differences are these overseas schools tend to be very well funded. Most schools I've worked for, there's never been an issue of shortages or this thing of having to buy school supplies for my students out of my own pocket. When I hear about my colleagues in the U.S. talk about that, it just blows me away. I mean, I can't think of any other profession where you would be expected to buy your own supplies. I think it's ridiculous. And so that's one thing I really prefer about the overseas schools, that and no one's trying to shoot at you. And I say that only half kidding, but during the few times that I've come back to teach in the U.S., it's usually been short stints, and there's always that underlying fear of, oh my God, is a crazy person going to come in here and start shooting up the classroom? So yeah, and I realize that I've just talked about car bombs and Lebanon and everything else, but there it's like you're probably going to be okay so long as you're not running for a political office. But in the States, all you have to be doing is teaching math.
Just so I can kind of get a rough idea in my head of kind of how you bounce around schools. So you mentioned Lebanon and Bali. What other schools and countries did you work in?
It's a list. So there was Beirut, Bali, Borneo. There was New Zealand for a bit. There was Sweden. There was Qatar, and then back in the U.S. for a little while, and then Kathmandu, Nepal, and then Warsaw, and then finally Milan.
Wow,
Italy.
So it looks like kind of all over the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, as well as out there in New Zealand. Sounds like quite a plan. And so since it's such a various geographic place that you were going to, how would you go about picking the next destination? And tell me a little bit about the recruitment process.
Yeah, I'd say that's something I would perhaps do a little differently if I could turn back the clock. The one thing that can really blemish your resume as a teacher is, and I think it is true for a lot of jobs, is moving around a lot. And I can point to every one of these countries and explain why I was there for only a short stint. And for the most part, it was just, not a good fit, or things were not as advertised, or it was just dumb luck. But I guess generally speaking, the way that the recruitment process works is you are there's a few avenues. The probably the best known ones are two major agencies. There's Search Associates and there's ISS, not to be confused with ISIS. So these two agencies are kind of like the big dogs for American overseas schools. And although they also work with British overseas schools, Canadian overseas schools, and what they have done over the last couple of decades or so is collected these massive databases of teachers and schools and tried to match them up. Every year, they host a number of job fairs, or at least they were up until the COVID times, and these job fairs are insane. They're often referred to as meat markets by teachers, and they're not for everyone. Me personally, I always loved going to them because they're great opportunities to network, even if you don't get a job. You learn so much about the field and all the schools that are out there and what folks are offering, and get to talk with fellow international teachers, often teachers who have more experience in the field than you, so you can kind of pick their brain. There's also a lot of shenanigans, there's cocktails and things like that throughout the weekend. And it's always hosted in a really big fancy hotel, like, a Grand Hyatt or something like that. And it's such an insane experience because you have teachers who, historically have not made a lot of money, and they're going to this grand event in a 5-star hotel, and usually in some very expensive city like San Francisco or Singapore, and somehow they make this happen several times a year, every single year. Again, I kind of like the feeling of competition and lining up those interviews with all these top tier schools, but again, it's not for everyone. And the good news is, in recent years, there have come along other agencies that have a more low-key approach. And I think in the long run, these guys may be the ones that outpace the long-standing alpha agencies in the field. So these are companies like Teacher Horizons or TIC. TIC is one of my personal favorites. They're based out of the UK. And these guys, they don't host fairs. They have you present your resume to them, and they really just do the hunting for you. So TIC, I've worked with a lot, and the way it's usually worked with them is I let them know that I'm looking, and they get back to me in a week or so and say, hey, we've got this school in Yangon who wants to talk to you, or we've got this school in Bucharest that wants to talk to you. And they line up the interview, you sit the interview, and you get the job or you don't get the job. But yeah. But it saves, the airfare and the hotels and all that rigmarole. It's not, some would argue it's not the same as conducting in-person interviews. And of course they'd be right. But, at the end of the day, I think especially in these times, doing things over the computer is just the new normal.
Of course, it seems like a very big expense and risk. If you don't get what you want, of going all the way to the other side of the country to just go for a job fair. It's crazy. You could barely get me to go down the street for a job fair, but going all the way across the world. I just had a friend that went last November to the one in Bangkok, and she got a job in Vietnam. It seems like a very big event and big part of the process. And how do you, when you're not using a company like TIC and you used to go to these job fairs, how do you decide on which school you want to go to, or how do you decide which are the top tier schools?
Yeah, that is a really difficult question to answer. And just when I think I'm starting to figure it out, I learned that I've been wrong. I mean, I as I kind of alluded to before, I have jumped into bed with some of the wrong schools for sure. And we'll get into that with Warsaw, but Warsaw was one of a handful of others. Unfortunately, I mean, a lot of times, especially if you're not conducting the interview in person, it can be hard to say. I mean, going back to Lebanon, it wasn't just the country. There were some things about the school that weren't quite the right fit. And even though I interviewed in person with the director and the director sold the school very well, and I'm not putting this on him or the school, but it just wasn't quite right. And so I guess as a teacher and as a professional, you just kind of have to ask what it is you're looking for. When I took the job in Bali, I knew that it was a school in its first year of operation. The person who interviewed with me, one of the people who interviewed with me, was pretty upfront and said, there's a lot that we just don't know how it's going to work yet. So you'll be a part of that process and it's going to be messy. And so knowing that, I was on board. And it, part of it was the excitement of being a part of a project like that. But part of it was like, I've got an opportunity to live in Bali for at least a year. I mean, and so as a younger teacher, that made a lot of sense. But as I got on into the years of my career, what became more important was working for a school that had us act together. It was less important about the location. So like the school I worked for in Qatar, they had it together pretty well. Excuse me, they were part of a network, a larger network of schools. They were well funded, and that wound up being a pretty good match. And then the school in Nepal, I mean, I was there for 3 years, British School of Kathmandu, absolutely loved it. Probably the 3 best years of my career. The school had their curriculum sorted out. They had strong leadership, and I just trusted the people that I worked with at all levels. And the country was difficult to live in. I definitely did not choose that school for its location, but looking back on it now, even the experience of living in Nepal was a really formative experience for me. And so yeah, I'm glad that all worked out as it did. But it's hard to tell from any interview what the job is actually going to be like, and it is a real leap when it's a leap of faith, not just, for the job and the people that you work with, but also the country. Because anyone who's trying to hire you is going to paint a very rosy picture of the country. Only a really good employer is going to give you the bad and the good.
Absolutely, yeah. And I asked this question because, there are lots of opportunities out there and lots of school offers, ranging from China to Vietnam to all over. And I feel like one of the biggest leaps of faith, as you mentioned earlier, is pulling the trigger and just having faith that that's going to be what they say there is. But then there's always those horror stories of getting there and it's a completely different thing than what was advertised. Other than the school in Warsaw, did you have any other experiences of arriving to a school and it wasn't what you expected it to be?
Yeah, I'd say so. In my book, I have a whole chapter about red flags. And so, I mean, some of the things to look out for are, if you look at the website, do you see just Halloween pictures of the students, or do you see them actively learning in the classroom? And for those classroom pictures, is it all just a bunch of kids with their hands up? Because that's a bad sign. You don't want to work in a school that relies on kids putting their hands up. You want to work at a school where they're actively engaged in something. So if they're huddled around a table working on a project, that's a good sign. You also, there's also a little bit of, I don't know how to put this. There are some cultural considerations to look for as well. I mean, a lot of schools will, because there's a bit of inherent racism in a lot of international schools. You'll want to beware of schools where the students pictured are, blue-eyed, blonde-haired kids. If they're only putting their white supermodel kids on the landing side of their school's page, that's a red flag, because a truly international school is going to have a truly diverse population, and there should be some representation of that on their website. One school that I landed at that I would say was not as expected was the one I worked for in Borneo. And there were some red flags at the beginning, but I ignored them because honestly, myself and my partner at the time, we were really hungry for work, and there just wasn't anything coming our way. And so a friend from Bali actually connected me with the school he was working at in Borneo, and it seemed legit. I mean, there was from the interviews, it sounded like there was a lot of money behind the school. There was a lot of support for teachers. We were even flown down to interview in person, which I was pretty impressed by. But there were little things like the decision making for the school all seemed to be centralized with one guy who was also the owner. And I remember watching him snap at a waiter and thinking, who does that? and so when we did relocate down there, I mean, there was a lot that was great about living in Kota Kinabalu. We had this beautiful apartment with a sunset and a sunrise view. We had a beach, easy distance from where we lived and worked. So that was all great. But I've never worked at a school that it was like a really bad Harry Potter movie. All the kids wore robes. All the teachers wore robes. I don't know who does that anymore. There was a flag ceremony at the start of every day, and they would sing the school song, which was also written by the owner/director. It was weird. And like they modeled themselves after a British school, but having now worked in a few British schools, this was maybe a British school from 1960. It was, and yeah, there was just a lot of yelling at kids, and there was a lot of it was not the kind of learning environment I wanted to be teaching in. So yeah, that was one that we wound up scrambling away from. Because it was just getting too weird too fast.
So we kind of talked about some of the red flags and some of your horror stories. What about the perks? So let's talk about some of the good stuff about working abroad. What would you recommend, or what would you say are the perks of taking on these opportunities?
Well, I would say that overall the perks outweigh the pitfalls. I mean, I had mentioned before that these schools tend to be much better funded than any public school that you work for stateside. And with that funding comes often a better salary for the teachers. Even if the bottom line on your contracts doesn't seem like that much money, if you weigh it against the cost of living in that country, you might be surprised. Like I think that I made that my monthly income was less in Nepal than it would have been if I'd been working stateside. But the cost of living in Nepal was so low that I wound up saving an incredible amount of money, even while taking a holiday with every single school break, which, by the way, is another perk. If you're already based someplace overseas, then it's a lot easier to travel on your holidays, and often you're making enough money to where that's easy to do. So in most of the places where I've lived and worked, I mean, especially in Asia, it was very easy to hop on a plane and just be in another country within a matter of hours. Europe is similar, and you can also take trains around, which is great. So the so living abroad just opens up your horizons for travel a lot more too. I would also say that if you find yourself in a bona fide school, then you're going to find the caliber of people that you're working with is much higher. And I'm talking about the students, the parents, and your colleagues. The students tend to come from families where education is a family value. It's treasured, and these kids are reminded every single day. You go to school, you learn as much as you can, you work as hard as you can, you do what the teacher tells you to do. And so class management is not as much of a time suck as it is in American public schools. The parents, while you do get your helicopter moms and dads every once in a while, there's usually one or two in every class. Most of the parents are tremendously supportive and active, and they will ask, what can we do to help our kids along, and they'll actually follow your advice. And then the people that I've worked with have just been incredible over the years. Even at schools that were less than bona fide, they still managed to attract some of the best teachers in the world. And that's always impressed me. And you make these networks that are really with you for life. Even though Lebanon was almost 15 years ago, I still am in touch with the people I worked with there. I mean, we still go to each other's weddings, and we'll probably wind up going to each other's funerals. So you really make some lifelong connections, and that means that anywhere you travel in the world in the future, you'll probably have a couch to sleep on. So that's a perk too.
I couldn't agree with that anymore. I think it's such a great opportunity for people, especially who are younger, who are adventurous, who are looking to explore the world. Most of these contracts, or at least from the better schools, will all include airfare, will help you sometimes with housing, or at least put you up for the first couple of months as you find housing. So it's a really smooth transition to leave your environment in the States and make your way abroad. But the perks on top of that, as you mentioned, are also the vacation. So if you are like just trying to, travel, but you want to still keep working or make some money while you're doing it, it's such a great way because you're making money, and then you have, all the fall breaks and the winter breaks and the summer breaks, and it's plenty of time to also explore and travel. And usually you're in, like, as you mentioned, in these areas or hubs like in Asia or Europe, where it's just so much easier to get around. And, for us going, 8 hours on a road in the States, you're just going to a different state, but there, you can go to 5 different countries. Also, like the tax benefits, at least when I was working in Korea, the salary, if you made under 100 grand, you're actually not getting, you report it still on your US income tax, but you're actually not getting taxed. So, that's like another, tax savings that you're also saving on, that you can kind of add to your salary. Also, the last thing you mentioned is the cost of living. So, we both taught in Poland and, or Nepal, and these are places that are very, very affordable to live in. So while the number might not seem super high on your contract, in reality, when you're talking about take-home pay and savings, your rate can be higher than, much higher salary living in the States. So.
Yeah. To that, I would say that, you really, really do need to research the cost of living, because in Nepal, the amount of money that I saved wound up being a lot higher than what the interviewers had described. So that was good. But in Italy, it was quite the opposite. I mean, the person I interviewed with said, you can expect, even with traveling and everything else, you'll be able to save a few thousand every year. I was running paycheck to paycheck in Italy, because Milan is notoriously expensive, but I was pretty surprised at how quick I burnt through money there, and I wasn't really living extravagantly either.
It just comes down, I guess, to kind of, as you mentioned, doing the research and seeing all the benefits that come with. Because I was working one teaching contract where my housing was covered, my airfare there was covered. The school was providing all the food, and it was really good food as well. And
wow.
I really had very minimal expenses. There really wasn't anything that I was basically paying for, and except for, leisurely going out or, going somewhere on the weekend. So it's just a really easy way to kind of save some money. And especially at a young age when, back in the States when I was working in the corporate world, that was like paycheck to paycheck. Everything was going for, taxes or car insurance or car payments. And at the end of the month, you're just like, what savings do I have here? I definitely think there are definitely some financial incentives as well, that if you do research. So
yeah, I mean, East Asia and the Middle East especially, you'll often find that the contract covers practically everything. And but I mean, then there's kind of these hidden perks. I mean, American School of Milan, as an elementary teacher, our lunches were paid for, and you had mentioned that with yours too. But our cafeteria staff were all Italian, so we had amazing lunches, and there was even a dedicated pastry chef working in the cafeteria there. I mean, it was over the top. That's something I miss a lot. Yeah, I mean, in the States, meanwhile, I mean, it always galls me when I come back home and I'm like, I got to pay for health insurance? What the hell is this?
I got to pay for the sloppy Joe at the cafeteria here? What the heck?
Yeah. Another thing that you mentioned, though, was and I agree when you say that it's a great opportunity for young people, young teachers. I mean, you want to. Most schools want to see you have at least 2 years of classroom experience before they'll hire you to work overseas. But I see a lot of middle-aged and older people who work overseas. People with kids who work overseas, and I think for people who haven't done that before, it's really a leap, and because they have a lot more on the line than a young teacher does, because they probably have a mortgage. Maybe they're holding on to their car back home, so they got to make the car payment. They might have some outstanding debts that they're worried about. So, but I find that they also, so long as they land well, that can be a really rewarding experience for older people as well, because it's something new. And especially if they have kids, it's a great experience for parents raising their children, because another perk, no matter what your age or family situation is, you get immersed in a completely foreign culture, and you get to see how people live outside of America, and that can be really eye-opening, for better and for worse.
Absolutely. And the key to that, of course, is doing a lot of research to make sure that the school you're getting is right. But yeah, I definitely can vouch that it's very valuable for families. I know a couple friends, older friends who have families already. And, when they go to these international schools, your kids, instead of being surrounded by a whole bunch of other, let's say middle class or wherever you're growing up in the States of basically like-minded people, you're now surrounded your kids by kids from Korea or Qatar or Malaysia or Mexico, or like 60 different cultures all in one classroom. And, it's this big melting pot, and they're making these connections with people from all over the world. And even just, for example, I remember like them playing sports, like our sports conferences in the States, you're going through like high schools within a 5-mile radius of your school, while they're going to, Budapest for a tournament, or Berlin for a basketball tournament, or, it's like, what a crazy high school experience to have that, and to have that kind of global perspective at such a young age is such a phenomenal opportunity for the kids. So, not to mention learning languages and immersing yourself, as you mentioned, in a culture that's so foreign from yours. It just teaches kids to adapt and be creative, and realize that, just because you had one perspective your whole life doesn't mean that's the only way that is right or the way to live, that there are different ways to go about things in life. So
yeah, and I think also it gives adults and their children a chance to see what they have in common. I mean, you go out to the playground of one of these schools, and you'll see kids from all over the world, and they're still all, playing basketball or playing soccer, or, making up games. I mean, so, the kids inherently all pretty much want the same stuff. And so to see those commonalities at play is really eye-opening for everyone.
I know also that it's a really cool experience, at least some of the schools that I've seen, especially these, let's say, higher tier international communities, they have a really strong community that revolves around them. You know, they have a really strong parent-teacher organization, and they have all these community events where basically the community life revolves around the high school. So they'll have like, you know, yoga once a week for the whole family or for everybody in the community, or they'll have organized races, and you know, like the whole community, the school, just becomes this really small little compact community within this bigger country. And it can kind of make you feel a little bit like, you know, make it feel more comfortable as well, you know, instead of feeling like you're like a foreigner inside the country. You have other expats as well living there with you. But what I also wanted to touch upon, and you mentioned it earlier, were some of the hot areas or hot opportunities right now to teach at. What would you recommend based on your experiences, or people you know recommend as some good areas to look into for teaching?
Well, I mean, this is always a tough one to answer, and it's especially tough with the pandemic of things right now, because I don't know how COVID has changed the field. COVID was kind of one of the reasons that I made the hard decision to leave. But let's just assume, you know, things normalize sometime soon. What has been the trend is East Asia and the Middle East tend to be the places with the best pay packages. A lot of times, though, they're also some of the harder places to work, depending on kind of what your thresholds are and how you define hardship. I mean, I mentioned before that Nepal was probably the most difficult country I've worked in, but then again, it was also super rewarding. I would not have chosen to go there originally, but I'm really glad that I did now. Beijing, I worked there for 2 years, and I had wanted to work in Beijing for a long time. I can tell you that most of the people I know personally would probably never want to work there, because it is polluted, it's busy, it's crowded, it's loud. It is very foreign, unless you have working knowledge of Mandarin. It's completely immersive. And while I loved that about Beijing, it's definitely not for everyone. Many people I think would find that overwhelming. And so that's kind of your trade-offs to consider for Asia. For Europe, everyone, it seems, in America wants to work in Europe, and yeah, it's rewarding. It's a little more familiar because it's you know, a lot more westernized, and you I shouldn't say westernized. I mean, it is the West, but it feels a lot more accessible. That a lot of the systems are familiar or can be paralleled to systems that we have in America, and you know, the food's more familiar, a lot more familiarity. So because a lot of teachers want to work there, the jobs are way scarcer, and there are fewer schools to choose from, and and also because of that, schools will typically pay teachers a lot less than what you'd see in Asia. So you might not get that annual flight in and out of the country. You might not get any flights at all. I mean, in Milan, the biggest expense for me was the rent. That was the first time that school didn't pay my rent, and that was a real shocker, because it was easily 30% of my income to live in my tiny European apartment there. So while Europe may have immediate appeal to a teacher who's considering jumping into the international field, there are a lot of economic considerations you need to keep in mind, and also know that if you go to a fair or enroll with any agency, they are going to probably present you jobs in every other part of the world except Europe, because they're really trying to get teachers into those roles. But these European schools, they usually have all the teachers they need. So that's Europe. The other parts of the world I can only speak to loosely based on what I've heard from my colleagues. But the experience with South America, my mistake. South America tends to be, if you're looking for culture, there's tons of it. You won't be disappointed. And the pay packages tend to be fairly low, but so is the cost of living. The number one thing I hear, though, from every single teacher who has worked there is that crime is an issue. And so you just have to consider, again, what your threshold for that is. Because I hate to use generalizations, but most, in fact, 100% of the teachers I have talked to have all been robbed at some point while living and working in South America. And just like I was with, Lebanese car bombs, they take it in stride. You're like, yeah, it's just a thing that happens. You just accept that one day somebody's going to stick you up and take your wallet, or that somebody's going to break into your house and steal your laptop. You just deal with it. And I get that. But for me personally, I that's beyond my threshold. I'm okay with the car bomb 20 minutes down the road. I'm not okay with somebody breaking into my apartment. So for me personally, that'd be a no-go. But man, I would love to see Argentina someday. And Africa, I think, is a lot of teachers who are thinking about getting into the field. They immediately turn down opportunities in Africa. And I think that that's a terrible mistake. Every single teacher I've talked to who has worked in Africa has loved it. And a lot of times they'll go there just because it's the only offer that they get at a job fair. And they reluctantly, like me with Nepal, reluctantly dragging your duffel bag over. But man, when you arrive, it's just so rich and so vibrant, and I've heard nothing but good coming out of Africa. Egypt specifically can be a little tough just because it's kind of like Beijing. It's fast, it's active, it's immersive, it's in your face, and you can't get away from it. But if you're into that, then yeah, Africa, great place to consider. And then Pacifica, there's not a lot happening for hiring American teachers. They've pretty much got their bases covered. If an opportunity were to come up, I'd say take it. But again, keep in mind that your pay package is probably not going to be amazing, and that you'll be living paycheck to paycheck, much the same as if you were working in American public schools. It's New Zealand was especially expensive, and so you really have to have a plan to live thriftily if you take a job down there.
And so some teachers who are, or let's say recent graduates who are newly minted teachers, or people transitioning into the career who might not have those 2 years of experience that you mentioned earlier, are there any tips or recommendations that you have for people to kind of get their foot in the door in the industry? Because it's a really weird cycle, right? It's like they want teachers, but then if you don't have the 2 years experience, it's like, it's really tough to find those good opportunities.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of catch-22s like that in the field. Yeah. When I talk about those 2 years, we're talking 2 years working in the States. But I also realize that there are some people who would like to do this, but maybe haven't finished a teaching program, or people who have finished a teaching program, but they haven't landed their first teaching job yet. And yeah, the market can be pretty tough for teachers some years. And so there are schools that will hire teachers even if they haven't had any full-time classroom experience. They tend to not be these top tier schools, though. There's a few diamonds in the rough, but mostly they're just rough. The school I worked for in Beijing was was one such example. I kind of picked up on it from the interviews, so I kind of knew what I was getting into. It wasn't a surprise for me when I got there and I found that they didn't really have their act together, that there was a lot of problems with how the school was being led. But I made the most of it. I found positive-minded colleagues. I found colleagues who I could learn from and improve myself professionally with. So I managed to turn it into a positive. But I mean, that school, and there's many others like this, they would hire teachers who maybe weren't even certified. There was one person I worked with who had done English language instruction in I think Korea and China, and she got hired on as their English language specialist. Now, she didn't have any degrees or anything to back that up, but she had the experience and she did it pretty well. And as one person, one colleague in Nepal pointed out to me, his story was just go and knock on the door. He happened to be backpacking in Nepal, and he heard that the British school was looking for a certain kind of teacher. So he literally just walked up to the gate and handed his resume to the guard, and they wound up doing an in-person interview the next day, and he was hired on as a teacher full time. So sometimes it's just, I mean, and when I was when things bottomed out in Warsaw, I discovered that I had gone to the job fair previous to getting hired in Warsaw. I'd gone to the Bangkok job fair and got no good offers at all. And I was really bummed out about that. And I had been looking at all these European schools. Nobody would even talk to me. Mm-hmm. But when I was suddenly finding myself at the end of my time in Warsaw, and this is like November, all of a sudden I was able to line up interviews with one European school after another. So just being in the neighborhood can give you a lot of credibility.
When you are teaching at these schools, are the opportunities mostly ESL, English as a second language, or are there opportunities to also teach other subjects such as math or science or history?
Yeah, so a question that people ask me all the time when I talk about working overseas is oh, so you were teaching English then? and every teacher who works in overseas schools, like these kind of embassy schools and such, they always cringe a little bit at that question, because there are kind of two different worlds here. There's the folks who go to teach English in foreign countries, and there's folks who go to teach, at elementary and high schools in foreign countries. And so I try to explain it by saying that, the schools I work for are just like the schools that we have in America, except that, the kids are coming from all different corners of the world, and the pay is better, and no one tries to shoot at me. And they're like, oh, but as my partner will point out, though, because she has worked in different parts of the world as an English instructor, and that is a great way to go about this as well. I mean, a lot of folks will do that right out of their undergrad program, because most schools that have this kind of program will look for fresh undergrads, and it's a great way to get out there and build up some overseas miles. It is sometimes a pathway to working in a more of a full-time all subject kind of school, like the colleague I had mentioned in Beijing, who came over as an ELL teacher and wound up being a department head, and now, last I checked, she's the head of their IB department, and so there is a path there, but it's a pretty narrow path, and you have to navigate it exactly right if you want to come in through that way. And I should also mention the IB thing. Some stateside teachers will know what I'm talking about here. And most overseas teachers will recognize IB as the International Baccalaureate. They have programs that start at the bottom of elementary and go all the way through high school. And it is still largely considered the gold standard in international teaching. And it's just a curriculum framework that a lot of overseas schools follow. These tend to be those top tier schools. And so if you can get some IB experience under your belt, no matter whether you're working in elementary, middle, or high, if you can get some of that experience, maybe even stateside, because some stateside schools use this curriculum model as well, then that can be a major foot in the door for working at some of the top tier schools. Not all of them follow the IB, but a lot of them do. But this is another one of those catch-22s, because if you apply for a job with an IB school, the first question they'll ask is, what's your IB experience? So that's where coming in with a school that maybe isn't so much a top tier school can be a gateway to that. Because if they offer to pay for your IB training, then you do your 2 years or whatever with those guys and then move on to something.
Are there any kind of takeaways you get for if someone finds themselves in a situation where things didn't kind of play out the way they wanted to in their contract, or maybe some preventative measures when searching for international opportunities to teach? Any kind of takeaways and lessons you can share that based on your experiences?
Oh yeah. I would say never be an early adopter. If you have an offer from a new school, turn it down. Let them work out those kinks. And if they're still around in 5 years, then maybe. I would say also that you should not be afraid to pack your bags. I mean, the school will tell you, and some of these placement agencies will tell you that if you walk away from a contract and you're blacklisted, you'll never work in international schools again. That's only partly true. I mean, there are always schools that are hungry for teachers, and it may keep you from getting into a top tier school right away. But even then, you do a contract here and a contract there at maybe a not so hot school, and so long as people see that that you can finish a contract, then they will understand that maybe that school just wasn't a great fit. I would say another big takeaway was that advice that my friend gave me, which is if something's funny with your paycheck the first time, pack your bags. If it's funny the second time, leave. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that any interviewer on earth would argue that point. Why did you leave the school? Well, they didn't pay me. Okay, then next question. And also be aware of how much a director or an interviewer talks in the present tense, or talks in the present tense versus the future tense. Because if they keep talking about, we are going to have this curriculum in place, we will soon have this massive sports field. Like if they talk a lot about what is going to happen in the future and don't talk very much about what's already been accomplished, then chances are that's a problematic school, because they're speculating on the future without much of a foundation in the present.
All great tips there, Sam. Thank you so much. And we really appreciate all the lessons and tips based on your experiences of teaching all over the world. Quite an impressive resume. And I bet you have tons and tons of stories, and we could keep going on and on about some of your experiences. But if people want to learn a little bit more about teaching abroad, I know you have written a book recently. Where could they find this book? And tell us a little bit about what the book includes.
So the book is Around the World on a Teaching Certificate, and it goes from step one, how to transition yourself from somebody who's teaching in the United States to somebody who's teaching abroad, and it has a really detailed breakdown of of the different schools and curricular programs that are out there, things that you should do to prepare yourself, things that you can do to go into these interviews confidently or these job fairs confidently. So just a lot of practical stuff that I guess I wish I had known 15 years ago. So you can get a copy of this for free on my website, or on my blog, which is deepsouthrefugee.com. And I'm constantly revising it because the playing field changes all the time. And so stay tuned to that.
That's great. That's very valuable information for teachers. And as we mentioned earlier, you do have to take this huge leap of faith. So why not get some valuable advice to make a wise decision before you kind of take on that role, so you can kind of avoid making some of the mistakes that you have made or other teachers have made, and having a good opportunity. You also do a really good job of explaining the situation ISW on your blog. So if you want to get some more information, it's like a nail biter to read. It's like almost like a criminal novel. So check it out. Also, it's on the blog at Deep South Refugee. We'll post the link in our show notes so you guys can check it out there. Sam, I had a blast talking with you and sharing some of our experiences abroad and hearing about your journey, and it's been fantastic so much. And hopefully it inspires, or at least gives people an idea of different opportunities that are abroad in terms of teaching. So I want to thank you so much, and I wish you the best of luck. And I forgot to ask you, we forgot to end it. Tell me a little bit, what ended your teaching career abroad? What made you kind of decide to finish things up?
Oh yeah. Well, if another takeaway for me with Warsaw was, even after all these years in the field of learning what works and what doesn't, I came out the other side of that realizing that I still don't know much. that there's still a lot of mines in the minefield of international education. Again, the perks definitely outweigh the pitfalls, but I kind of had banked everything on that working out. I was wrong. It led to a great job at ASM, and I thought with that would kind of be the ticket moving forward. But then the COVID of things happened, and you talk to any teacher and they'll tell you, I mean, Zoom teaching is not the same as classroom teaching. And that really, I don't know, between that and just, you can only put your stuff into 3 cubic meters so many times to where you just say, I really want to plant my feet. But the bright side of this story is also that in that interim between Warsaw and Milan, I was back home for about 6 months, and I met someone really special, and we said, she had also worked internationally as a teacher, and like me had decided it was time to pivot into something else. And so, we decided to move back to the Northwest because it's the one place that we've always really felt at home. And so I guess that's kind of the final word on this is some people travel all over, and some people find that their home is in Seoul, Korea, or is in, Kathmandu, Nepal, and they stay there for the rest of their lives. So for me, it was always the first place that I had adventured out to, which is the Pacific Northwest. And I finally made my way back, and it feels pretty good.
Nice. Well, I can't imagine a better way to kind of wrap things up than having a nice little uplifting story and you finding your home and settling down and settling your roots. So thank you so much, Sam, and I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. It's been great.
Well, that does it for this week's episode of Travel Tribe Podcast. Join us each Tuesday as we release new episodes with great adventurers. Until then, remember, the most dangerous thing you can do in life is to play it safe. Stay adventurous.